A very good evening to one and all. Myself Anukriti Raj, the moderator of the series Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, organized by Expressions in Languages and Arts Foundation, Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh. On behalf of the President, Professor R.P. Singh Sir, I extend my heartiest greetings to the speaker this evening, Dr. Niloy Mukherjee, and to all my dear friends and participants who have joined us. So we are to begin the session by playing the signature song of the foundation composed by Professor R.P. Singh sir. So it's almost a week back we started our series Bhasha Sahitya or Samaj, Kavya Path, Charcha Evam Samvad. And in its continuation today we have with us Dr. Niloy Mukherjee, who would be sharing his views on nation and nationalism Understanding Rabindranath Tagore's Perception. Before inviting Dr. Mukherjee, I would like to introduce the speaker to the participants. Dr. Niloy Mukherjee is an assistant professor of English at Techno India University, Kolkata. He completed his graduation from St. Xavier's College, Kolkata, and post-graduation from the English Foreign Language University, Lucknow. He has a PhD in English from Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia National Law University, Lucknow, where he worked on the interface of law, literature, and women's studies. A keen observer of life with an indomitable passion for post-colonial theory, Dr. Mukherjee has a penchant for using his critical lenses a little too often. So now I request Dr. Mukherjee to please share his views.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, fair enough. So, a very good evening to one and all. It has been an absolute pleasure for me to be given this opportunity by the ELA Foundation, and thank you, Anukriti, for that lovely presentation, and more, especially more so for inviting me over to speak to such a wonderful audience today. So, without any further ado, I would straight away move on to my topic, Nation and Nationalism, Understanding Rabindranath Tagore's Perception. So, as we have to, first of all, let us gauge the context where Tagore existed, where Tagore came into the Bengali intelligentsia. So, Rabindranath Tagore, or as we Bengalis fondly acknowledge him as Rabi Thakur, was born at a time when British colonial power was at its zenith. During Tagore's formative years, Bengal was mightily influenced by basically three major movements. The first of the three movements was the initiation of religious reforms by Raja Ram Manohar Roy. I'm so sorry, Ram Mohan Roy and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, in which Devendranath Thakur, the father of Rabindranath, was an active participant. The second movement was Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's transformation of Bengali literature with the infusion of an element of militant nationalism. The third major influence, which initiated the Bengali Renaissance in the pre-colonial India, was the unprecedented consolidation of the ideas of nationalism that reflected a strong desire to break away from Western domination and Western influence. Over here, we understand that to be British influence and British domination. Now, the influence of the educated middle class in Bengal, facilitated by the proliferation of the English education system, were on a steady rise, and being exposed to the Western anti-colonial discourse, it created a fertile ground for the educated middle class Bengalis to promulgate a problematic discussion on nationalism, patriotism, and a blueprint for self-governance. The reason why I mentioned this to be problematic is because this was not in tandem with what the ruling British government wanted. Okay, and at that point of time, you must realize that most of these educated middle class Bengalis were from the Babu strata, okay, where they worked in bureaucratic offices, but with the British government's expectation of these brown sahibs following them. And now that when they are posing questions to them, when they are asking problematic questions to them, and that's exactly the reason why I use the term problematic. So along with the rise of this educated strata of Indians, the culmination of the Hindu Mela, which at that point of time was also known as the Chaitra Mela, because it was it took place during the Chaitra Mash. That's the name, the Bengali name of a particular month. So the Hindu Mela or the Chaitra Mela, that was conceived by a person called Raj Narayan Bose and was actualized by Nabagopal Mitra in 1867. Now this Mela became the primary base of nationalistic thought in a pre-colonial India, leading to an enormous flowering of patriotic poems, patriotic songs, patriotic novels, and other literary works. The word national earned a new respectability. Okay, and many organizations such as national papers, national theaters, national societies, national schools, started evolving right from this juncture. Tagore's political and nationalistic writings began at this time, at this point of time. Like Tagore, for the other Indian writers and thinkers, the zeal to uphold this prominent themes of nationalism received a further impetus with the establishment of the direct rule of the British Queen over India after the Sepai Bidroho or the Sepoy Mutiny, or like the Indian historians, name it as the First War of Independence on the part of the Indian soldiers. Rabindranath Tagore acknowledged that from the very beginning of his adult life till the end, he reflected on major issues of politics, economics, and society on the basis of his experience. Okay, so there's a experiential nature to his writings. Okay, there's most of his non-fiction and discourse is quite referential, quite contextual in quality. So, and especially the reason why it is not dogmatic, something that we understand, by reading, let's say, Black Skin, White Masks, or something which has a very solid touch to reality, something that has a very solid touch to practicality. So, as far as Tagore's non-fictional writings are concerned, this was essentially very, very practical, very, very real. So, from a very early age, Tagore was a vocal critique of the socio-political events which happened around him. At an age of 16 or 17, he wrote a pamphlet fiercely criticizing the subservience of the princely states as they unquestioningly, accepted the British rule by completely surrendering their sovereignty and self-respect. In 1877, he expressed a, stringent criticism of the Delhi Darbar for its expensive political show in front of the Britishers at a time when there were major parts in South India who were reeling under a terrible famine that costed almost 50 lakh of lives. At the age of 17, Tagore left for England for the first time. And this visit was an important event in the evolution of his political ideas, as it helped him emerge out of the prevalent dogmatism and narrow nationalism which were existing in Bengal at that point of time. The creed of liberalism, which was articulated by the likes of the political thinkers like John Bright, William Gladstone, that appealed to him. So, he was exposed to this entire gamut of Western ideas, Western discourse, once he left the country and, went for this, sojourner in England. Okay. And what he basically appreciated is the sense of independence and individualism among both, men and women in Victorian Britain. Tagore's first published work, called that particular work is known as Kobi Kahini, that came out in 1878 when he was still in England. This early work of Tagore was basically a revolt against the inhuman expansion of European colonialism. But what makes this work particularly important is that there was an optimistic aspect of the book that remained integral to Tagore's life, his ideas and his philosophy. For the very first time, Tagore's envision, he envisions humanity transcending the present cruel phase of colonialism and its sectarian principles, sectarian strifes, and reaching a stage of freedom, peace, and harmony. So, he had basically predicted an evolution. Okay, so that kind of drudgery which was existent in those modern times after the First World War, after the Second World War, something that we can relate from the writings of the modern poets, the modern writers, T.S. Eliot, Wasteland, etc. So Tagore had envisioned that there would come a time when humanity would evolve out of this drudgery. So for the first time in his literary works, do we get to see a reflection of his philosophy of pluralism and universal brotherhood that Tagore upheld as his core concern in his entire life. At the age of 21, he wrote another poem, which later became very famous. The name of the poem is, Nirjhore Shopno Bhango, which later on, like I said, gained immense popularity. Once again, in this poem, we see Tagore promulgating a similar order of universal brotherhood, whereby he compares all human beings to be different rivers that eventually flows onto the ocean. Now, there were two contradictory influences which left a lasting impression on Tagore during his years of infancy: the influence of the Vedic and Upanishadic literature and the European materialistic and spiritualistic philosophy, to which he got exposed after he visited England. Now, the confluence of both these two influences guided him to revive the Vedic ashramite culture, the Vedic ashramite order, and modernize it. In order to do away with the existing dogmas, the existing discriminations and injustices, the existing, discriminations of caste, creed, which were prevalent at that point of time in India. Now, having championed the principles of pluralism in his concept of the nation and nationalism, Tagore distanced himself, or rather, he took away, he kind of distanced himself from the growing parallel movement of militant nationalism, which was inspired mainly by Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's writings. Tagore was also critical of the early Congress, which consisted mainly of the privileged class, the privileged bureaucrats, privileged lawyers, privileged zamindars, and in their way of negotiation, they were quite moderates. Okay, so their usual way of functioning would be to plead the British, the British officials for favors, either for themselves or on behalf of a few hand-picked Western educated property Indians. In fact, they had, being the national party, being the national representative of the country, they had no connect with the ordinary people and played a very meager role in the development of the nationalistic, patriotic sensibilities amongst the rural masses. Now, being the representative of India, Tagore wanted the Congress to comprehend the problems of the nation, to feel the problems of the nation, and to bring it closer to the masses, to make it much more accessible. Now, during the British preoccupation of dividing Bengal in 1905, Tagore was not convinced by the Congress's idea of boycotting British goods. During a rising tide of extremist nationalism within the Indian political circles, Tagore emphasized on the need of national unity, joint leadership of the Hindus and the Muslims, and a revival of the panchayati system. He proposed an alternative and novel scheme of establishing a parallel government based on mass solidarity and reconstruction of the quintessential rural ethos of India, the quintessential rural ethos of India. So that he identified as a Swadeshi Samaj. Okay, Swadeshi Samaj, that became the blueprint of his proposal to meet the challenge of the division of Bengal and the factional politics that the Britishers had resorted to in order to subvert the rising tide of nationalism in India. Tagore believed that the history of a nation should not be articulated as a study of the state apparatus or the power of the monarch or about its war and victories, but it should include a narrative of the people, their perception, their folklore, their welfare. He quite, although we acknowledge Foucault for, his deliberations on discourse and the discursive violence and the epistemic violence, Tagore almost a decade ago identified, although he couldn't name it like Foucault did, but he identified this epistemological violence that the Western discourse had perpetrated on the colonized mind. Okay, and he decried the influence of the European historians, particularly the English historians, for fabricating Indian society and Indian history. Unlike the other thinkers and intellectuals of his time, let's say, for example, Marx or, for example, Gandhi, where we can distinctly differentiate between an early Marx and a later Marx, an early Gandhi and a later Gandhi, Tagore's political writings on nation and nationalism has remained quite constant and rather consistent. His political non-fictional writings and outlook exhibited a larger sense of continuity and unity. His vision of a nation evolved from a broad, unorthodox acceptance of an Upanishadic framework, which included a larger plurality of different identities, belief structures, and religious orders in search of a universal world order, universal harmony. Tagore believed that the new India, which would evolve out of the clutches of the colonial domination, would be able to harmonize the new practices of the new age along with the older ones. Repeatedly, in his different pamphlets and essays, therefore, Tagore highlighted, acknowledged, hailed India's pluralism, which for him would be a core and a non-negotiable principle. Central to Tagore's idea of nationalism was the idea of community, which was not necessarily communal or factional, on the basis of caste or religion. Tagore expressed these ideas of a community or communal solidarity in his essay Nationalism, which was translated to English in 1970. In this essay, Tagore observed that the larger edifice of a nation, the larger the larger concept of a nation was non-existent in India until the colonial forces arrived. There were villages which were self-governing and had the twin characteristics of practicing, simple laws and leading a peaceful life, a non-interfering life. Now, with the arrival of the British, this entire demography, this entire dynamics changed. With the arrival of the British, India faced a well-organized nation. In the influence of the East India Company, the old societal bonds disappeared and were replaced by a more, organized mechanical setup, which resulted in a perpetual confrontation and conflict rather than harmony. Thus, Tagore blamed the Western models of a nation and nationalism for dividing the world into permanent adversarial bodies, for making different nations, rather antagonistic to each other. Okay, and let's say initiating conflict between the two rather than harmony. Thus, Tagore blamed the Western models of a nation and nationalism for dividing the world. Now, drawing from the ideas of Darwin's survival of the fittest, Tagore believed that the modern form of nationalism was motivated only by the expression of its superiority, distinguishing only between the victor and the vanquished, where no other higher moral or human goal existed. Thus, Tagore highlighted the menace that aggressive nationalism posed and also looked into the motive of the modern state behind formulating such a structure. Tagore believed that there was a profit motive of the nation state behind maintaining such a permanent military industrial complex, where each new nation state would be looking out for its own profits. Okay, and all of this culminated in the Industrial Revolution. That's what Tagore had to believe. As an alternative to the dangers of such narrow religious sectarian beliefs and aggressive nationalism at the expense of liberalism, Tagore offered his idea of universalism as an effective substitute. Tagore's framework for understanding India and its people was not only progressive, but desirable, especially at that point of time when India was fraught with conflicts. Okay, a lot of riots were happening, a lot of wars were happening. So at that point of time, this particular concept of Tagore with a certain amount of healing potential was exactly what the nation needed. And not just, it's not like that would be needed at that point of time, but also in these times when people are so sectarian in their beliefs. Okay, so like nations are formed out of ethnicities, nations are formed out of nationalism. So Tagore believed in a higher order of a formulation of a community. So he was the culmination, as such, Tagore was the culmination of the project that had begun with the Bengali Renaissance, with the likes of Ram Mohan Roy, Vidyasagar, and Swami Vivekananda. In his perception of the new nation, he envisaged the presence of the age-old humanism that India preached for centuries. His intrinsic libertarian individualism matched his urge for freedom and democracy, making him one of the outstanding voices for its defense when the future of the democratic world was still hanging in the balance, especially when we are talking about the times that preceded the world wars, or like after the First World War. So democracy at that point of time was a very questionable concept. Quite often, quite known, rather quite popular for being a mystique, a romantic, and a poet who occupied the highest position as the poet of the world by spreading the message of harmony to the global audience. It is this role of Tagore of being a propagator of a universal faith, a universal order, and universal pluralism that goes unnoticed and yet continues to bind the nation as it sustains its unity in diversity. That's all for me. Thank you for your patience and being such a wonderful audience. Thank you. Anukriti, I'm done over here. You can take on from here.
Okay, yes. So, what a wonderful and I would say that scholarly insight you presented before us, Dr. Niloy. It was really, thank you once, thank you for your very erudite, presentation and lecture which you presented
Thank
before
you.
us. Although it was very, very brief, very, you put forth it, in a very lucid way, and it was very easy to understand. But in a way, I would like to summarize, the key points, the participants as as a today's takeaway from the session. So for that, I mean, yes. Okay. So what I could, I mean, as what I could have understood that, as one of the celebrated intelligentsia of his times, Tagore was known for being a mystic, a romantic, and a poet who took the name of India to the highest altar of literary achievement. Tagore envisioned a humanity transcending the present cruel phase of the world wars and the sectarian strifes of colonial warfares by reaching a stage of freedom, peace, and harmony. His vision of a nation evolved from a broad, unorthodox, acceptance of an Upanishadic framework, as you said, which included a larger plurality of different identities, belief structures, and religious orders, in search of, a very universal harmony. His intrinsic urge for truth, freedom, and individualism matched his literary creation, making him one of the outstanding voices of pluralism, empathy, and humanism. So, in that way, that would be, I mean, the takeaway from the today's session, what you talked about, that was very erudite and, very scholarly, very well researched. I would say that, and we are very, delighted to have you here. And I would like,
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
सो यस तो अगर मैं कुछ इसी मैं इसके अलावा मैं पहले सोचा कि कुछ दूसरे फ्रीडम फाइटर्स को हम थोड़ा आई वुड बी इंट्रोड्यूसिंग सम अबाउट द अदर फ्रीडम फाइटर्स इन दिस एपिसोड बट आई थिंक दैट हियरिंग यू दैट वुड बी नॉट बी वेरी एप्ट बिकॉज ये दिस इज़ द फेज ऑफ निधि ध्यासन और हम जब मनन और निधि ध्यासन पे जब आए तो दैट वुड नॉट बी वेरी एप्ट to talk about any other freedom fighter or any other spiritual guru in aligned with this Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore ji.
It might be very possible because I took up such a humongous amount of time that you are failing to like come up with any other discussions.
No. It's absolutely fine. I mean, we would we'd love to hear that, and we even if we are running short of time, otherwise we would have continued this session. I would just stressed it out. सो मैं थोड़ा सा अगर हिंदी में बोलूँ तो मैं कहूँगी यही कि रविन्द्रनाथ टैगोर जी जो गुरुदेव मानवता को राष्ट्रवाद से ऊंचे स्थान पर रखते थे। गुरुदेव ने कहा था, जब तक मैं जिंदा हूँ मानवता के ऊपर देशभक्ति की जीत नहीं होने दूंगा। ईश्वर और इंसान के बीच मौजूद आदि संबंध उनकी रचनाओं में विभिन्न रूपों से उभर कर आते हैं। जैसे कि आपने बताया, बहुत सारी साहित्य की बात कही आपने, तो साहित्य की शायद ही कोई ऐसी विद्या है जिसमें उनकी रचना ना हो, जैसे गान, कविता, उपन्यास, कथा, नाटक, प्रबंध, शिल्पकला, सभी विद्याओं में उनकी रचनाएं विख्यात हैं। तो इसी के साथ में आई वुड बी वाइंडिंग अप टुडेज सेशन। थैंक यू सो मच डॉक्टर मुखर्जी। इट वाज रियली नाइस एंड टू हैव यू with us, and it was very nice to hear you. Thank you participants for your patience hearing, and so on a concluding remark, I would be playing the Abhar Geet of the foundation for your kind attention and reception, and later we will be winding up the session. सम्यक चिंतन बढ़ते जाना। आ, आ, सम्यक चिंतन दृष्टि हमारी और सुगमता ध्येय हमारा। अंत खड़ा जो पंक्ति सगन में उन तक जाना उनसे कहना। अंत खड़ा जो पंक्ति सगन में उन तक जाना उनसे कहना। इस पद पर जो मिले हृदय से धन्यवाद आभार आपका। धन्यवाद आभार आपका। धन्यवाद आभार आपका। So, thank you participants, and tomorrow we would be again joining at 6:30 p.m. for another talk, So, we are ending the session here. You could sign off. Thank you, Dr. Naloy.